Kia ora koutou. Welcome everyone to our webinar for the Development Contributions Policy Review 2025. My name is Hannah Ballantyne, your host for this webinar. A bit of an agenda. First, I'll introduce the team behind the screen and let you know how you can participate during the session. Then, I'll hand over to our presenters who will run you through a very brief overview of the project. So today you'll be hearing from Alan and Amy, who are our subject matter experts on this development contributions policy. Your mics and cameras are switched off so that we can keep the session moving, but you can ask questions in the Microsoft Teams chat, which is located on the top bar menu as a speech bubble. If you're not able to use either of these, you can email questions to letstalk@ccc.govt.nz. If you're hard of hearing or if you're experiencing sound issues, you can turn on live captions. Just click on the three small dots above More at the top of your Teams screen and click Turn on Live Captions near the bottom of the drop-down list. One last thing from me. Hopefully the banner came up to let you know that this session is being recorded. This recording will be shared on our YouTube channel in the next few days. You'll receive a link showing you how to access this recording along with a copy of the PowerPoint slides. I'll now hand over to Alan to start the presentation.
Thanks, Hannah. So we thought we'd start with a bit of a introduction to development contributions for those who are less familiar with the policy. So DCs are a charge that enable the council to recover a fair, equitable and proportionate share of the costs of providing infrastructure to service growth from those that benefit from that investment, so that is the developers. The revenue received from development contributions is derived from and tied to the council's investment in projects in the capital program. We can only recover DCs for infrastructure that is to be provided, and the revenue cannot be used for any other purpose. DCs is a cost recovery tool for the growth component of projects that the council has already agreed to put in the capital program. And if we didn't recover these costs from DCs, we would recover them from rates. Next slide. So you'll see this term used a lot in the DC policy, a HUE, means a household unit equivalent, and it's how we measure demand in the DC policy. It's essentially the demand that's placed by a single household. So one lot is assumed to contain one HUE. And DC charges are not random numbers. We calculate the DC charge per HUE on a per project basis by dividing the cost to deliver the growth component of an asset by the number of new or additional households. So as an example, if the growth component of an asset was $1 million and the projected number of new households was 10,000, the HUE charge for that project would be $100. And do this for every project to get a HUE charge for that catchment and activity. So as part of this review, we've gone through the policy and looked for ways that we can better assess for demand being fair to ratepayers and developers. So we'll work through some of these policy issues now. So the first issue that we looked at, which we're actually not recommending a change to, is the life of existing demand credits. So existing demand credits provide an efficient way for councils to fairly treat both developers and ratepayers when allocating the cost of infrastructure to service growth development. The council's policy has been to limit the life of existing demand credits to 10 years. And we think this provides a balance between being fair to developers and recognising that previous development has occurred on a site, and being fair to ratepayers, and that the liability to provide growth infrastructure to service a particular lot isn't in place forever. The current 10-year life of credits has been in place since 2007, and then prior to that, credits had a life of 5 years. And we are recommending that we retain the current 10-year life of credits. And we do also note that the current expired credits in the Central City were calculated last year. And then using our draft DC charges, the value of these credits is over $20 million. So we would forgo fairly significant revenue if we were to make a change to this policy. The next policy issue we looked at is DC remissions. So the current policy provides a remission to be granted in unique and compelling circumstances. The intent of this clause was to allow the council to address a matter directly associated with the DC charge, but we are finding it is encouraging some developers to seek what is essentially a grant from the council. There have been very few remissions granted over the years because the threshold is intended to be high. It's meant to be that there is something so unique about that development that we didn't consider when we were drafting the policy, and so it's not built into our averages. We believe it would be better to remove this provision from the policy. Council could still provide a remission if required via a council decision inconsistent with its policy, which is allowed for under Section 80 of the LGA. Alternatively, if the clause was to remain, we suggest strengthening it so that the intent of the remission is clear. And we do also note that rebates and remissions are not the same thing, and rebates sit outside of the policy. Another issue we've looked at is the small residential unit adjustment. So the council currently reduces DC charges for residential development with dwellings that have a gross floor area of less than 100 square metres. The reduction is in line with the GFA. So an 80 square metre GFA is assessed at 80% of the DC charge. But what we are finding is that houses in Christchurch are getting significantly smaller. In Christchurch in the last year, 45% of building consents were for homes less than 100 square metres and 24% were for homes less than 80 square metres. This means council is providing a discount for close to half of all new homes. And so we're looking to move to a residential unit adjustment based on bedrooms and keep a small adjustment just for one bedroom homes. And the reason we're doing this is that we have data that shows that 2/3 of all one bedroom units have one person living in them and 80% have two or fewer. So the average household in Christchurch is 2.6 people. And so one bedroom homes have half the assumed demand. And the DC policy is based on assumptions and averages, and we're really only looking to adjust in situations that are significantly outside of assumed demand. On the other end, we've also looked at a large residential unit adjustment. So the current policy does not make any adjustment for large residential units, but we're getting an increasing number of multiple tenancy houses with lock-up rooms that have an ensuite and then a shared sort of kitchen lounge space, particularly around the university. And these are currently assessed as a single household unit because they only have one kitchen, but we know that there is at least 6 people living in them. So the draft policy includes a large residential unit adjustment, and we're suggesting this apply to 7 or more bedrooms because of how we define a bedroom in the policy, and that large residential units will be assessed at 1.4 Huey. And then we've also made some minor changes to the policy. So we've clarified some provisions around special assessments. First relates to stormwater discounts when developers provide their own on-site mitigation. So we're suggesting this mitigation only kicks in when it reduces demand on our network by 50% or greater. And this will bring it into line with other special assessment provisions. We're also suggesting remove the stormwater discount for attached multi-units. And we've done this because we have updated the average impervious surface area per site. The new averaging takes into account that dwellings are getting smaller, and because our averaging now reflects that assumed demand, we think there's rationale to remove the multi-unit adjustment. We're also updating the Huey multipliers for non-residential development, and as part of this transport methodology, we'll move back to activity or land-based units, and we think this is more fair than the current zoning that is in our 2021 policy. We've also included a provision for the council to charge a fee for development contribution assessments, and we've also made a range of changes to the definitions in the policy to provide greater clarity for both developers and for our DC assessment team. And then we've made some changes to our catchment approach as part of this policy. So we have 2 separate issues that we've looked to address. The first is the concentric approach that we currently take for neighbourhood parks and road network, which has resulted in a greenfield catchment that primarily spans the outer, so that sort of southwest, northwestern parts of the city. These catchments were first developed when the council had a lot of greenfield land, but as we revert to pre-earthquake patterns and development is increasingly occurring in infill areas, there's less rationale for that greenfield catchment. And so we're proposing to move to more localised catchments for neighbourhood parks and road network to better reflect how people use and benefit from these amenity infrastructure. The second issue we've taken a look at is our catchments for water activities. So Plan Change 14, MDRS and other central government planning changes will enable growth to occur virtually anywhere in the district, and it makes it hard for the council to plan for the provision of growth infrastructure. So we are suggesting that the council uses fewer catchments for water to enable a more flexible whole of city response to Three Waters infrastructure requirements to service growth development. The number of catchments that we have is also currently administratively complex, and it's putting us at significant risk of under-collecting DCs. So we're proposing to return to fewer larger catchments for water supply, wastewater and stormwater, and this will also better reflect the integrated nature of the council's approach to delivering these assets. And we'll now walk through those catchment maps. So neighbourhood parks and road network will move to a localised approach. So that's a central, south, west, north and east catchment, and then a Banks Peninsula catchment as well. So stormwater will be an urban catchment and then a Banks Peninsula catchment. So water supply will have an urban catchment that includes Littleton, Governor's Bay and Diamond Harbour, and then a Banks Peninsula catchment. And then for wastewater, we have that same urban catchment as water supply, but we have split Akaroa Harbour from the rest of Banks Peninsula. And this is because of the wastewater treatment plant out there, which only services Akaroa Harbour. And then we're not proposing any changes to the rest of the activities. So community infrastructure, sports parks, regional parks, and garden and heritage parks will have that district-wide catchment. And then public transport and active travel will have an urban catchment, and no changes here either. So in terms of the charges, we'll just walk through these quickly. So Central, the per huey charge will be $29,562. East, the charge will be $29,273. South will be $32,031. West will be $37,200. North will be $37,166. Banks Peninsula, so where all the catchments are Banks Peninsula, the charge will be $23,635. And then Akaroa Harbour, that charge will be $44,083. So we do recognise that the charges have increased from our 2021 policy, and we do have some reasons for that, which we'll work through in a second. But we do think it's important to see the context of these charges over the last three policies. And so what you'll see on your screen is in green, we've got our 2016 DC charges. Our current charges are in purple, and then our draft charges are in orange. So overall, our charges are reflecting a return to where we were about a decade ago. So in terms of what's happened to our charges, so earlier on, I explained that the DC charge is the cost of growth divided by the growth. So in terms of that top line, the overall capital program increased significantly between the 2021 and 2024 LTPs. The schedule of assets within the DC policy, which you can find in Appendix 2, lists all capital projects with a growth component. And the total growth between the current and the draft policies has increased almost $200 million. So in terms of some other aspects that increase the cost for council to deliver growth infrastructure, the DC policy also includes adjustments to the funding model to ensure that total revenue equals total costs after accounting for interest and inflation. So the assumptions that are built into the policy are consistent with what's in our LTPs. So on your screen, you'll see LTP 2021 in orange and LTP 2024 in blue. So both interest and inflation have increased significantly between 2021 and 2024. And this increases the cost to council to deliver this infrastructure. So I'll now hand over to Amy to talk about what's happened to our growth modelling.
Hello. Cool. So I'm just going to quickly run through a bit of a summary of what has happened with growth over the last few years. But to get us started, we use Stats NZ's future growth projections for our population and household growth. They have and continue to provide a good indication of projected future growth for Christchurch. Historically, our actual growth has tracked very close to the median projections, but we do monitor this closely to ensure that they're still fit for purpose and would adjust them if we saw indications that we needed to revise what we were using. Our future population projections are produced by Dr. David Dyson, an economist who works out of Lincoln Uni, and he has been undertaking this modelling for us since around 2020. Cool. So into the growth models. We have a suite of growth models that take high-level projection and model where growth is likely to occur in the city at a sub-city level. The outputs of the models inform the infrastructure planning done by others here at the council. So your asset planners, which informs your DCs. Modelling is inherently based on assumptions and of course doesn't provide us exact forecasts, but it is our job to get these assumptions as close to reality as possible. And to do this, our team undertakes a comprehensive monitoring program which supports the growth modelling. We have a really good relationship with our colleagues down at Stats NZ and with David, who does our business forecasting, and we regularly feed back to them, which in turn makes the data that they produce more reliable. So we have a bit of a circular thing going around the projections. And into some population change. So Christchurch has had a bit of a rough 15 years in terms of population growth and the ups and downs that we've had, which does make forecasting particularly difficult. Following the 2010 and 11 earthquake sequence, and you can see it there on that graph, the city's population rapidly decreased by around 21,200 people. As most of us are aware, probably, this was driven by a significant downward swing in net migration as people left the city following those earthquakes. As we moved into the recovery phase, the population then climbed rapidly and our annual average population growth increased by around 800 people per year when you compare it to the pre-earthquake averages. Then just as we were getting back into a more normal pattern of growth, COVID-19 hit and we had a couple of years of very, very low growth. Again, in the past couple of years, we've seen this to return to more of a normal level of growth for Christchurch again, similar to what you could see pre-earthquake. Those trends pre-2010, which you can see in that graph, give a good indication of what normal looks like for Christchurch. And we could see that that trend was re-emerging in the years between the earthquake peak and then COVID. Cool. Into some of the changes between the projections that inform the last policy and this new policy that we're consulting on. So generally, projections that inform this policy forecast a slower rate of growth than the projections that formed the basis of the 2021 policy. And a Stats NZ evaluation of the accuracy of estimates and projections between 1996 and 2018 found that rapid population changes are a significant factor in relative errors. So the projections that form the 2021 policy were made at a point when the city had just experienced a sudden and unexpected shock, which you can see pretty clearly in that previous graph. But in 2013, when we prepared the last policy, it was still the best information that we had available to us at the time. And it was those 2013 base projections that factored in those population shifts and changes following the earthquakes. I think for us, it's just really important and a good reminder that projections are made at a point in time and they're based on the best information available to everyone at the time and are updated regularly. So it's important that we're reviewing and revising our growth modelling as we go and as new information becomes available. Those fluctuations are normal and should be expected, perhaps not as big as we've seen over the last few years, particularly in that post-earthquake period. But it is normal and change, especially as changes are made to the inputs and assumptions that form the basis of the projections modelling that Stats NZ does. Cool. And this graph shows you in a little bit more detail the difference between those two sets of projections for the previous policy and the one we're consulting on at the moment. Most of the change between the two projection sets is in the longer term projections, so post 2028. In the first 10 years, there's between around 1% and 3% difference compared to the projections in the 2021 policy. The difference, however, in the long-term growth projections ranges from 2 to 11% and grows over time, as you can see reflected in that graph. Again, it's just a good reminder that growth projections change, and it's important that we keep on top of the latest projections and, more importantly, understand why they're changing, but we can't expect them to stay the same. And I'll hand back to Ellen now.
Thanks, Amy. So one other thing we did just want to touch on is a recent announcement that was made that impacts development contributions. So at the end of February, Minister for Housing and Minister for Infrastructure, Chris Bishop, announced changes to the infrastructure funding and financing tools that are available to local government. So development levies are planned to replace development contributions. Development levies and development contributions are broadly similar in that they are both charges that are paid for by developers while undertaking development. Under the proposed new system, councils will still be required to identify projected growth and the cost of infrastructure projects required to service that growth in order to calculate the levies. But councils will no longer apportion growth or infrastructure to certain areas of the city. Instead, levies will be set across an urban area, so that is citywide. Councils will also be able to add an additional charge on top of that base levy if there is an area that requires particularly high cost infrastructure for a specific activity. So some of the methodology that's used to calculate development contributions or development levies will be standardised as well. And the government's expectation is that this will reduce cross-subsidisation of growth development by ratepayers. So it'll essentially avoid some of the DC leakages that we're currently experiencing and that other councils experience in their DC policies. Government has indicated legislation will be introduced in September, and we expect it all enacted by mid-2026, and the proposals will come into effect from 2027. But until new legislation is enacted, councils have a legislative requirement to have a policy on development contributions and to review it every 3 years. Therefore, at this stage, we are continuing to review our DC policy in line with our legislative requirements. So in terms of where to from here, consultation is open on this policy until the 26th of March. We will then have hearings on the policy alongside the annual plan in April. And staff will be working through your submissions, analysing them and working through your recommended changes to the policy. And we'll take all of this to council in May, and we'll have a workshop or maybe 2 workshops with them on those policy changes. And then following that workshop with the council, we will bring a final draft policy to them in June, seeking their endorsement to adopt the final policy.
Cool. Thanks, Ellen and Amy, for the presentation and for all the questions that have come through both during the webinar and when you registered. So let's go through some of them. So the first question that I've seen is when would the changes to the development contributions policy apply? And for the resource consent applications lodged before this date, would they still be subject to the current DC policy? Is that a you question, Alan?
So we are required under the LGA to assess for development contributions based on the policy that was in place at the time a complete consent application was received. So if you have a consent that is submitted under our current 2021 policy, you will be assessed under that 2021 policy. And then if you have a consent that is submitted in full once our new policy comes into place, you'll be assessed under the new policy. And what our DC assessment team do is when they go to invoice you, you'll only pay under one consent. So if your consent assessment is lower under your draft policy, under the draft policy, then you'll pay under that policy. And if it's lower under the new policy, you'll pay, if it's lower under the old policy, you'll pay under that too.
Oh, thank you for that. Next one. Oh, it's a bit specific. So the Belfast Area Plan that was adopted by Christchurch City Council in 2010 to facilitate its growth should have development contributions applied to execute the infrastructure needed for 100% growth. Why isn't it? Can we ensure an appropriate provision for fund allocation for this to happen?
So it's important to remember that development contributions are a cost recovery tool for projects that are already in the long-term plan. DCs don't get applied to an area, they are applied to projects. So if there are projects that are related to the Belfast Area Plan or projects that are intended to service growth in Belfast, they will be added to the development contribution policy, and then we'll collect development contributions to pay the growth component of those projects. So essentially, projects get added to the LTP and then we collect DCs for them.
The next one, how do we get the necessary infrastructure into those communities paying development contributions? For example, pathways to connect bus services, etc., without it going into the long-term plan.
So it's not a chicken and egg situation. The projects need to be in the long-term plan first or the annual plan, but they need to be in the capital program. So we can't circumvent that by adding them to the DC policy in order to get them into the capital program. So it's LTP first. And if there is a particular project that you think needs to be added to the capital program, then you need to talk to your councillor or to your community board in order to get those projects into the capital program.
Right. Can the development contributions policy be separately identified rather than funds being spread over Christchurch and not in the areas actually growing?
So development contributions are ring-fenced to the catchment and the activity for which they are taken. So we don't take DCs from a certain area and spend them in another catchment. Now, some of our catchments do span large portions of the city. So right now we do have that Greenfield catchment that spans that sort of northwest, southwest part of the city. So DCs they can be spent in different parts of the city, provided they are part of the same catchment, but they are ring-fenced to that catchment. And that's why we are suggesting changes to road network and neighbourhood parks to produce more localised catchments, because we think that will ensure that DCs remain in areas that reflect the use of those assets.
Great, thank you. So why has the reduction for 2-bedroom units been removed? Clearly, looking at the census data, the average occupancy is roughly 0.8 Huey. 3 bedrooms is very close to the average, so should receive no discount.
So I can answer part of this, and then I might hand over to Amy to talk about what we know of the census data. So our policy is based on assumptions and averages about average demand. So in terms of residential units, we know that the average household in Christchurch is 2.6 people. And so we are really only looking to adjust when something is well outside those averages. So we're only looking to capture when an average household is, say, 1.3 people, or an average household is over 5 people. And so that's why we've targeted our small unit adjustment just to the 1-bedroom homes, because what we know of the census data is that 2/3 of all 1-bedroom homes only have one person living in them, and 80% have 2 or fewer. So we know that they are well outside the averages that are built into the policy. But with 2-bedroom units, it's that 2-bedroom units sit within the averages built into the policy. So I'll pass over to Amy to talk about the census data.
Cool. So we've ordered some data from Stats NZ. We currently have the 2018 and we're just waiting on the 2023 to arrive from Stats NZ on, as Ellen said, taking the number of bedrooms in a household and looking at the number of people who live in that household, which has started to help us build a better understanding of how homes are being used and what demand in homes looks like. So as Ellen said, a significant proportion of our 1-bedroom households, close to 70%, have one usual resident, whereas 2-bedroom units have almost half, so 42% have one usual resident, and then 35% have 37%, sorry, have two usual residents. As we get into the 3 and 4 bedroom, we start to see it shift towards more people being in those households where it kind of matches the bedrooms. So those smaller units are a little bit more unique, but generally more than half of 2-bedroom households have two or more people living in them. So less than half are occupied by one person, which is under that demand that Alan talked about, the average demand at 2.6.
Thank you, Amy. Now, ask this one. It may be more of an operational question than policy, but we'll try anyway. In charging for development contribution assessments, will you only charge once, even if there are initial inaccuracies in the original calculation? Should it not just be a flat fee as you work with your community to establish a fair DC obligation?
So it is proposed to be a flat fee. It's been consulted on as part of the annual plan. I believe it's $100, but you'll see it in the fees and charges within the annual plan. And it's only paid once. It'll be invoiced as part of the invoice for the development contribution requirement. So yes, if there is some back and forth with the DC assessment team and the assessment gets revised, you will still only pay that one flat fee for the DC assessment.
Great. Considering the increase in DCs could be close to 20% on some developments, is the council considering our city ability to compete with other developments in Waimakariri, Selwyn, or further afield?
So we did look at this as part of the review. So what we know of when we look at Selwyn and Waimak DCs for the townships, so the Greater Christchurch townships, which are most comparable to Christchurch, our DCs are actually lower. And particularly in the more infill or suburban areas. So in Waimak, their DC started around $37,000 a Huey and go up to around $72,000 a Huey for their townships. And then in Selwyn, their DC started around 37 and go up to 44. And they do also have development area overlays for some parts of the district. Where the council is required to provide specific infrastructure to service a development, and the infrastructure gets ring-fenced to that development, and then that's added to the development contribution requirement. So in terms of our closest neighbours, our DC charges and our new policy are very comparable. And then in terms of the metro councils, it's particularly on the higher end, our DCs are a lot lower. So Auckland DCs are currently consulting on their draft development contribution policy, and their DC charges will start at around 22,000 and go up to, I believe it's 140,000, and that doesn't include water supply and wastewater. Tauranga, their DCs, I believe they started around 30 and go up to mid 70s, and it's the same for Hamilton. DCs are a little bit lower in Wellington. They don't have a lot of growth in Wellington district as far as we understand, so that would explain why the DCs are a little bit lower. But in terms of the Greater Christchurch councils and our fellow metro councils, our DC charges are really very comparable and do fairly reflect the cost for council to deliver this infrastructure to service growth.
There has been a follow-up to that question. So let me know if you can answer, Alan. If you can't, that's fine. So the question focuses on the industrial logistics and manufacturing of DC assessments. Might need some more information, and we can come back on it.
Yeah, we might need to take that offline. That seems that it would be specific to some of the Huey multipliers. So we might need to have a chat with our asset planners and then come back to you.
And the same is The same can be said for the 2 other questions that we've received. We will just have to take those away and talk to our asset planners and get some detailed written responses for you. So we'll get on to that as soon as this is over and provide some responses back. So I think that covers everything. So we've reached the end of the presentation. Thank you to everyone for taking the time out of your day to join us. If you have any further questions about this consultation or feedback on the webinar, please contact the team and the details should be on the slide in front of you now. We'll be in touch over the coming days with answers to any questions we didn't get to and links to rewatch the session recording. Obviously, consultation on this policy review is open, so I'd invite you to head online to letstalk.ccc.gov.nz/development contributions to tell us what you think of what's proposed by the 26th of March. Thanks again from myself and all of our staff. Tēnā koutou katoa.